Turn the Page podcast. Picking up on that conversation from last week, we're talking about the decision making process. Last week, we kicked it off talking about that conscious versus unconscious decision making, and we looked at awareness, speed, and control. Again, so if you're listening, listen. All right, if you're listening to this week's episode, you need to go back and listen to part one on decision making process. And then you need to go back and listen to the week before that. The solution to the problem you didn't know you had. Intentionality is the solution, because all of these things are linked together. But still recapping from last week. And last week we got to the considerations within the decision making process. We started talking about just point A, your future, but we left off at the point where we were talking about prioritizations within the consideration process. And the point was this: if I have considerations within the decision-making process, what things am I analyzing to see how this choice impacts this area? We looked at, even if I'm looking at those areas, what's the ranking of them? Which is more important than the other? What's the prioritization? What's your priority level? Like, it should always be there. There has to be a ranking system for every facet, every area in your life. God willing, you never have to tap into that and using it, but it should exist. It should exist, because you never know what can happen. Don't overthink, make a plan. You know what I'm saying? Don't overthink, make a plan. I kind of think about, I forgot what it's called, the disaster response, or whatever it's called within within companies, but large organizations, they basically have sat down and thought through every worst case possible scenario. What's the worst that can happen? Where can things go wrong? What happens if this happens? What happens if that happens? Large corporations, especially governments, have thought through any possible thing that can happen and go ahead and put a response together for it, hoping they never have to utilize that response. But in the event that something happens, they're already ready to go. The decision-making process, they've already put the plan together. So once their new decision-making process is, oh, let's go look at what we previously decided we were going to do to respond to this situation, right? That's what your ranking system basically is when you're prioritizing. Priorities change, right? But that's what you're doing when you're putting these priorities together in your mind. Not treating anything different, just going ahead to say, hey, if I'm ever in a situation where I have to choose this or this, I'm not gonna have to struggle over it, because I'm struggling over the decision now, so I don't have to struggle over the decision later. That's something we're gonna talk about too. Like, all of these points line up together. But the prioritizations part. But we're looking at considerations within the decision making process. Okay. The three considerations we're talking about, and there's a lot more, right? Your future, stakeholders, and responsibilities. Stakeholders. What are stakeholders? Stakeholders is everybody that holds a stake, that has skin in the game, that is going to be impacted by this decision. That's the stakeholders, and this kind of rolls together with responsibilities. The third point. Who are the stakeholders? What are the stakeholders? What's the prioritization of the stakeholders? How does this decision impact each stakeholder? I say it rolls right into responsibilities. What is your responsibility to each of these stakeholders? Are you responsible for their well-being? Are you a steward over this stakeholder? Honestly, if you got a job, it really shows when you got a job. Like, which stakeholder are you responsible for? Customer service is customer stakeholder, right? So, which stakeholders are you responsible for? Who are the stakeholders? What are the stakeholders? How much knowledge do you have about the way stakeholders work in relation to this decision that you're making? You got to have some knowledge. Excuse me. Wow. You got to have some knowledge to effectively do this. If I were to give like a boom, 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 like a step-by-step formula for making the decision, because we're talking about everything that entails the decision, not actually going through the process. The process is almost simple. What decision needs to be made? What information do I have? What decision am I going to make? Literally, boom, boom, boom. What's the choice? What's the information? What am I actually going to do? That's basically, in short. That, gosh, they're also information dense, right? But really, that second part, the information gathering, the analysis, and you don't want to overdo it to get to analysis paralysis. We're going to talk about that later on too, because you got to make a decision. Gathering the proper amount of information is very important, because the information, the understanding, the knowledge that you have can all be used to make the best possible decision. And depending on your level of leadership, are these decisions that you're making, are you making decisions that are like just about your day-to-day life? Are you making decisions for a company? Are you making decisions for a school? Are you making decisions for a whole state? Are you making decisions for an entire country? It doesn't matter how many stakeholders, how many things are going to be impacted. Do you have enough knowledge about the relationship, the symbiosity? That's not a word, but it should be. Do you have an understanding of the connectivity between this decision and all your stakeholders? You make this choice. How does it impact this over here? How does it impact this over here? A lot of times when we're making decisions, we recognize that I'm not just making one decision, right? If you do this process properly, you recognize that you're making a snowball of decisions at once. Because during this information gathering phase, on the stakeholders and how they're each going to be impacted, you're doing your research. How does this impact this? Okay, well, if I make this decision, then it's going to result in this stakeholder having this and this stakeholder having this. Maybe it puts this stakeholder in a better position and it puts this stakeholder in a less favorable position. But now you recognize that, hey, this less favorable position has to be addressed immediately. Maybe this decision is great for this group, but it creates a problem for this group. And you're deciding that, hey, we now know that though this might be a solution for a large set, it's not a solution for a smaller set. And in making this decision today, we also need to go ahead and start considering what the decision is going to be about this problem. Is it going to be something, hey, if we do this now, we need to go ahead and do this too. Like this is a joint thing together. Is this going to be related into this current decision? Or is it going to be, hey, we're going to reconvene and meet together to talk about this before this date? Or is it, hey, we're going to cross this bridge when we get to it, but at least we know about it? It depends, of course, the gravity of the situation, level of responsibility, level of leadership, the institution. But personally, for me, my decision-making process, I'm really comfortable with I'll cross that bridge when I get to it kind of mentality, right? And what I mean, the reason I do that a lot, because even when I say I'm gonna cross that bridge when I get to it, I'm not waiting to get to it to think about it. When I say I'm gonna cross that bridge when I get to it, it means that I'm literally not going to sit down and go through the decision-making process at this point, because I have my own process. I'm not going to go through that whole process in this moment, but you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be thinking about it. It's tucked in my brain. It's kind of like, You got some trash bags. You need trash bags in the house. You look at it. You got a box of 100. You down to like 20. Cool. Hey, I know I got to get some trash bags. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But I'm thinking about it. It's on my mind. Like, you know what? So you know what? Let's write trash bags on the fridge on my grocery list so I know when I go. I'm not gonna go shopping right now, but when I do go shopping, remember to get trash bags. That's kind of what I do. I'm gonna cross that bridge when I get to it, right? So I'm thinking about it until it shows up. So part of my decision making process, and we're talking about that information gathering part right now. I'm gathering information leading up to it. It's not an active thought in my mind, but it's in a place in my mind where I might come across something that attaches itself to that. So it's kind of like, yo, I know I'm gonna need that when this come up. So let me just, okay, I got this idea. Let me tuck that away. So that when I get to the bridge to cross it, I'm not opening up my sack of nothing. I'm like, yeah, the other week. Yeah. So now let's think about this. You know what I'm saying? So that's my decision making process. I might cross that bridge when I get to it, but I'm gathering information because that information gathering stage is very important. You have to be knowledgeable about how this decision is going to impact all the different things that are attached to this decision. There's other stakeholders. And when I say, like, there's individuals, there's groups of peoples, there's institutions, there's concepts, there's like tangible, intangible stakeholders. How much knowledge do you have about the stakeholder? And then the knowledge is the knowledge that you need. Maybe you need to know how the stakeholders think. How well are you in tune with the ideologies of your stakeholder? How well are you in tune with the needs of your stakeholders? How well are you in tune with the way your stakeholders will respond? What, like, you need this information. Has your stakeholders been through this in the past? How did it impact them then? This is all information that you need to make the best possible decision. This should be part of the decision making process. You gotta be knowledgeable. You gotta have the information that you need. When I'm talking about, let's call it a third. So we talked about considerations, because that's what we're talking about now. Considerations within the decision making process. We're looking at your future stakeholders and responsibilities. And within the considerations, we then talked about how prioritization is linked right into that. Information is that next major component of this considerations part. How can you consider, like what are you considering if you don't have information to consider? Like when I'm talking about consider something, we're talking about consider your future, consider the stakeholders, consider your responsibilities. We're talking about the information. Consider, when I'm talking about your information, your future, consider your future. What information do you have in your future? What information do you have in your stakeholders? What information do you have in your responsibilities? And then all the other considerations, what information do you have on these things? You need information, and you don't need information for the sake of having information. You don't just want puffed up knowledge. You're looking for information that you're gonna actually apply. I'm gonna take this information in, and it's gonna be used to help me reach the best possible decision. Man, I had a great thought, and that thing just took off. But just using that information to make the absolute best possible decision. You need the information. You got to go out and get it. And it's there. It's available. You just got to put forth the effort to go get it. This is part of that decision-making process. You got to go learn some stuff. You have to go learn what it is you need to do. That's with the stakeholders. And you can see how the responsibilities is tied into that. Because anything you're responsible for is kind of still one of those stakeholders. But the reason I wanted to segment that is because you might not be responsible for all the stakeholders. Oh, here's the thought that I forgot. One of the things that I really used to love in elementary school, we used to do these math problems. word math problems, right? And one of the things that it taught us, because it was these particular problems was teaching us, was to figure out what's usable and unusable information. Because the word problems, it would just, the first couple of lines would just provide information. Da, 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 da. This is this, they're going here, this is what's going on, this. It's throwing out information, number, stats. Then it asks a question. And you have all of that information to consider. But then the next consideration, which information is relevant to me answering this question? And part of it was it threw so much information at you. If you were unable to make the decision to say or figure out, I don't need this information isn't relevant to the decision, you would spend a lot more, you would waste a lot of time because you're considering things that you don't need to consider. Yet, when you're able to say, hey, this isn't important, I don't need this information, now you're able to focus on, okay, this is all I need to make this choice. Boom, I'm good to go. Being able to figure out what's the relevant information. So I don't need you just getting information for the sake of it. I need you to get relevant information. Remember I said, if I was to give a 3-step process to decision making, what's the decision? That's the identification, information, implementation. Boy, that alliteration is coming out. Identification, information, implementation, right? And that identification part, figuring out like what decision needs to be made so that I know what information is relevant. Because I don't need you going out getting a bunch of information for the sake of it. You need to get the relevant information for the decision that you're making, right? What's the relevant information for your stakeholders? What's the relevant information for your responsibilities? What's the relevant information for your future? Because, and we're going to roll into this, when I get to the next point, there's a time component to this thing. In fact, let's roll right into it, because when I talk about the time component, it's impossible to not make a decision. Because it's impossible to not make a decision because no decision is still a decision. Acting too fast, acting too slow, or freezing is still a decision. You have a choice that needs to be made. If you move too quickly, you still made a choice. If you move too slow, you still made a choice. If you froze and chose not to make a decision, you still made a choice. It is impossible to not make a decision. You're not putting it off. Like, it's impossible to not make a decision. You're making the reason it's impossible to not make a decision is because whether you respond to it, whether you don't respond to it, whether you're on time, whether you're early, whether you're late, with the response, there's still a consequence. No, it's impossible to not make a decision because there's always a consequence. You're too late, there's a consequence. Too early, there's a consequence. Right on time, there's a consequence. Make a good decision, there's a consequence. Make a bad decision, there's a consequence. Make no decision, there's a consequence. You're never going to escape the fact that there's a consequence. And because of that, there's a speed component wrapped into this decision making. There's a speed component. Earlier, and that's part one, you got to go back and listen to that song. In part one, when we were talking about the speed in decision making, we were looking at the speed in which we reach the decision that we're going to make. The speed between consciously and unconsciously making a decision. However, there's also a speed to when a response needs to be rendered. You might not have all day. You might have all day information. That's important information to know about the decision that you're making. How much time do you have? The time part is so important because the best timing for the decision that you're making is the right timing. If you have until tomorrow to make a decision. What benefit do you have of rushing to that decision today? Yeah, to tomorrow. You have an extra 20 hours to cycle your decision making process. 24 hours, I know. You have an extra 20 hours to cycle through your decision making process on this decision. No, do you need to make this decision within the next 5 minutes? You don't got all day. You don't got all day. You're man, I remember I had this job. My first job out of college, I was a kitchen manager, and we were actually about to go through our grand opening. And I had these problems. Like, before you do something, problems gonna show up. And this is my first time going through something like this. And luckily the CEO, the owner was there. And when I started freaking out about, oh man, this just happened. What are we gonna do? I didn't know how to. I'm the manager. I should know this, but I didn't know. I ain't never done this stuff before. So I'm kind of freaking out to him, and he was basically like, "That's not important right now. We can figure that out later." I'm like, because in my mind I'm like, "Yo, the door's about to open in 5 hours," and he's like, "We'll come back to that. We got more important things to deal with. That's simple." Without even thinking about a solution to it, it was like, we got time to make that decision, but we don't have time to make this decision. So because of that timing component, the decisions that need to be made now need to be made now. The decisions that need to be made later can be made later, and we'll get it going along the way. You'll cross that bridge when you get to it. Knowing the timing of a decision, because if you make a decision that you don't need to make immediately, if you make it immediately, you might make the wrong one. I got to tell you, I used to be a salesman. I used to sell Rainbow cleaning systems. Love the product. I got one. But I used to walk in people's house and sell them a $4,000 vacuum cleaner. And when I first did it, I was like, oh my gosh, who gonna buy this? People bought it. People bought it. People came out of pocket for that machine. And part of the sales technique that we use, we put a lot of things in there to get you to make a quick decision, because it's easier to make a sale when people make quick decisions. I want you to notice, free game. I want you to notice, any sales person that you come into contact with, or people trying to get you to purchase something, come out of pocket. Notice the timing. Are they trying to get you to make a decision today? The biggest things about trying to get people to make immediate decisions and shorten the time is, when you offer immediate discounts, like, oh, today discount only, you don't get time. I was on Amazon one time, and I put something in my cart, and because it was on sale, and after you put it in the cart, it says 15 minutes to purchase it, or you don't get this discount, because it's trying to urge you to make the decision quickly and not sit on it. Because typically, the longer someone has to make a decision, not everybody, but for the most part, the more thought goes into it. And sometimes that thought to you is thought, to the seller is doubt. Because if you're sitting there thinking the whole time about, oh, this is great, then you probably would have bought it then. If you say, I'm gonna think about it, you're probably gonna spend the next time thinking yourself out of doing it. So they want you to make an immediate decision, because the shorter amount of time, typically the less thought that goes into it. However, an important piece of this conversation is bringing to your awareness this decision-making process, because some of the things that we've talked about, it's like pre-prepping a decision. You might reach this points where you have to make quick decisions, but it's not like you haven't kind of put yourself through this. You've already gathered some information. When you made that decision a month ago, you already foresaw that, okay, it was going to have this impact. It was going to have this, you considered this stakeholder already, and you've already begun to put a plan in place together, or had it floating through your mind, right? So you can do things, you've already got your prioritizations together. You already know what's a priority, and you already know what's a priority in this season. You've already been priming your subconscious. You've already been priming yourself to make better choices. You've already been priming yourself to be a go-getter, or priming yourself to be a little bit more riskier. You've been priming yourself to believe in yourself. You've been doing all of these things prior to the point you get to where you need to make a decision, so that if you reach a point to where, hey, leadership sometimes might require you to make a grave decision, a choice that has a high degree of gravity to it in a short amount of time. Because what we want, and ideally we want a 1-to-1 correlation ratio between gravity and time of a decision. The more gravity to the decision, the more time we would like to have to make it. But oftentimes, you have to make grave decisions in a short amount of time. You might be in leadership, and something suddenly happens that whichever choice you make is going to have a profound impact. You might have to make that decision quickly because it's an emergency. You might be in the hospital with a loved one, and there's a complication during surgery, and you have power of attorney, and the doctor comes out, and now they're asking you to make a life or death decision, and they're also like, you got like 3 minutes. Like, we don't have all day. You don't have time to go consider all of these things, and it's rough in the moment. But what have you been doing prior to that moment? How have you been priming your subconscious? What information have you got? What information do you have? I believe in gathering information for relevance, right? You want to get relevant information to the decisions that you're making, but you want to be generally knowledgeable. Know everything about your thing. Whatever your thing is, be an expert in that. But it's okay to have general knowledge in so many other things. You might be a PhD over here, but that don't mean you're going to take no 101 class over here or a 202 class over there. You know what I'm saying? So you might have a look. It's good to be knowledgeable. The more knowledge you have that you can apply when you need to apply it, the better off you're going to be. But there's a time component to making decisions. Some decisions are made quickly. Some decisions you have time. And like I said, when the gravity is great, we want more time. Sometimes when there's a small consequence to this, we feel like we want to have all day. When it's large, when it's a small consequence, it's okay to make it quick. But sometimes these big consequence issues, we don't have a lot of time to make. But I believe in those moments, that's when our decision-making process is very much important. We're considering it, we're priming it, we're getting ourselves together before that moment. We're already impacting our decision-making process, right? So guys, this has been a great conversation. Make sure you go back and listen to part 1, and make sure you go back and listen to the conversation before that, intentionality too, because we really talk about this priming thing. But the 3 things we looked at within the decision-making process, we looked at the conscious versus the unconscious decision-making. We talked about those. We looked at the awareness and speed and control as it relates to the unconscious and the conscious decision-making. We looked at considerations within the decision-making process. And again, within the considerations, we looked at how priorities were inherently a part of that, and information was a part of that. So considerations with the priorities, the considerations with the priorities and the information as it relates to your future stakeholders and responsibilities. And the last thing we looked at was it's impossible to not make a decision, because whether it's too fast, too slow, or freezing, not making a decision at all, it's still a decision, because you're not going to escape consequences. And that's why we need to have a better understanding of our decision-making process, and the way it works and impacting and influencing that for the better so that we're making great decisions. Great conversation. Really loved it. Enjoyed it. See you next week.